Lucas had been searching for a quiet place to get away from the rush, somewhere removed from the city's constant noise and flickering screens. He found an old house listed on Airbnb in a small town far from the highway. Pictures showed a charming, if weathered, building surrounded by trees and quiet streets that looked forgotten by time. When Lucas arrived, the evening was already stretching its dark fingers across the sky, and the fading light seemed swallowed by heavy clouds. The house stood stoic, its paint peeling, wood creaking gently as the wind whispered through the cracked windows. Lucas stepped onto the porch, the boards groaning beneath his boots like the house itself was waking slowly from a long sleep. The front door opened with a dry creak, revealing a dim interior coated with the dust of years. Inside, the air was cool and thick, the scent of old wood mixed with something faintly musty, as if the walls were holding memories better left untouched. Light bulbs hung from simple fixtures, casting a dull yellow glow that barely reached the corners where shadows pooled thick and heavy. The floor creaked underfoot as Lucas moved from room to room, each step echoing louder than it should in the stillness. At the end of the hallway, a heavy wooden door stood apart from the rest. It was locked with a rusted padlock and chained tight, almost as if whatever lay beyond was not meant to see the light of day. Earlier, when Lucas had asked the landlord about it, the answer was quick and flat, just storage. Nothing for guests to worry about. But the way the landlord's eyes flicked nervously toward the door before looking away told a different story. Despite a growing feeling of unease pressing at the edges of his mind, Lucas shrugged it off and unpacked his bag. But as night deepened, the house settled into silence that was anything but peaceful. Somewhere below, behind that locked door, something stirred. As the night grew darker, the silence in the house deepened, but it was no longer a calm stillness. Lucas sat on the edge of the worn couch, the faint light of his phone screened the only glow in the room. Then, faint sounds began to emerge from the floor below, the basement. At first, they were almost imperceptible, soft, deliberate footsteps padding slowly against the wooden stairs, the scrape of something being dragged. The noises carried with them a weight, as if the house itself was awakening to something long buried. Lucas froze, every instinct screaming to listen harder. Beneath the floorboards, muffled whispers tangled in the dark air. They were too quiet to make out words, but urgent, like a conversation held in secrecy. The hairs on his arms prickled, the room suddenly feeling colder, heavier, as if the temperature itself was shifting, pulling the warmth from the air. He glanced at his phone, no signal. The little bars that had been full moments ago vanished, leaving him cut off, isolated. A sudden click echoed from the front door. It had locked on its own. Panic threatened to rise in his chest, but Lucas forced himself to stay calm, telling himself it was just the house settling. Old houses did that, right? But the noises didn't stop. They grew closer, footsteps pacing just beneath the floor, moving back and forth in a slow, steady rhythm. Lucas's eyes darted toward the hallway where a faint draft had started to snake through. He noticed the air near the walls felt colder, a chill that pressed against his skin. Something was different. Something unseen was brushing past him. As he moved cautiously down the hallway, he stopped. A small table by the door, which he was certain had been empty moments ago, now held a set of keys. They weren't his. Lucas's heart thudded loud enough to drown out everything else. The keys were old, worn, and unfamiliar. He swallowed hard, forcing his legs to carry him back toward the living room. But each step felt heavier, as if the house itself resisted his movements. The shadows lengthened, and the faint sounds of whispering grew louder, wrapping around him like a cold fog. The locked basement door sat at the end of the hall, silent and unmoving, but Lucas knew it wasn't empty. Something was waiting down there. The pounding in Lucas's chest was relentless now, each beat echoing in his ears as he faced the basement door once more. The faint noises that had haunted the night were no longer distant. They were close, urgent, like something just beyond the thick wood, desperate to be heard. His hand trembled as it reached toward the cold metal of the padlock. The rust was rough beneath his fingers, and the door itself seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Then, without warning, the door shuddered violently, as if something on the other side was slamming against it with desperate force. Lucas stumbled back, breath caught in his throat. The soft whispers turned to low growls, then to frantic scratching that scraped against the door's surface, sending splinters of wood falling to the floor. The house groaned around him, the floorboards creaking underfoot as if warning him to run. He turned toward the front door, but the lock held firm, unyielding. Panic flared, sharp and suffocating. The windows rattled as the wind outside howled through the cracks. but inside, something else stirred, something dark and relentless. A shadow flickered at the edge of his vision, just beyond the flickering light of his phone's glow. Lucas spun, searching, but the room was empty. Only shifting shadows and silence greeted him. Then a breath, cold and ragged, brushed against the back of his neck. He spun again, heart hammering, eyes wide. The basement door rattled once more, the sound so violent it shook the walls. The whispers became clearer, voices overlapping, an unintelligible chorus of fear and anger, trapped behind wood and rust. Lucas felt the air press in on him, thick and suffocating. The lights flickered, plunging the room into near darkness before sparking back to life. And in that brief blackout, he saw it, a dark shape, fleeting but unmistakable, standing just beyond the basement door. His instincts screamed at him to flee, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. The house was alive in a way he could never have imagined. The locked door was no longer a barrier. It was a thin veil between him and something waiting, something that should have stayed buried. Lucas didn't wait for another moment. Heart pounding like thunder in his chest, he bolted for the nearest window. The glass was cold and unyielding beneath his palms as he struggled to pry it open, desperate for escape. Outside, the night air was sharp, biting, but it was freedom at least. He scrambled through the narrow opening, breath ragged, limbs trembling as he fled from the house that seemed to breathe shadows. The quiet street was empty, but Lucas's mind raced, unwilling to let go of what he'd heard, what he'd felt behind that locked door. He called the landlord once more, urgency in his voice, demanding answers. But the landlord was evasive, changing the subject quickly, unwilling to meet his eyes. Days later, after Lucas had left town, local police uncovered a sealed basement under the house. Inside, they found remains, long forgotten, hidden beneath years of dust and silence. The space had been boarded up, locked away from the world, but the house never forgot. It whispered in the night, echoing the trapped voices. Lucas never returned to that town. And though the house still stands, silent and waiting, the locked basement door is never spoken of, except in hushed tones, by those who know what hides behind it. Because some doors are meant to stay closed. And some houses keep their secrets, waiting for the next visitor who dares to listen. After weeks of relentless work, Claire was desperate for a break, a simple weekend escape to recharge her mind. She found a city apartment on Airbnb that seemed perfect, modern, cozy, and located in a quiet neighborhood not far from downtown. The host, a man named Daniel, had been polite and responsive, but something in his replies felt just slightly off. When Claire asked about security features, especially cameras, Daniel was quick to reassure her everything was safe. Yet he avoided giving a clear answer about whether any cameras monitored the building's common areas. It left a lingering doubt, but Claire decided to trust the reviews and the pictures. She arrived just after midnight. The streets were calm, empty save for the occasional distant hum of a car. The building stood tall but quiet, with a well-lit lobby that felt welcoming yet strangely sterile, almost too still. No other residents were in sight. The elevator doors slid open with a soft mechanical sigh as Claire stepped inside, clutching her bag tighter than necessary. The ride to the 5th floor was slow, each ding of the floors rising echoing sharply in the stillness. When she reached the apartment, the door was exactly as pictured, sleek, unassuming. Daniel had left the key in a lockbox nearby as arranged, and she let herself inside. The air was cool and smelled faintly of cleaning products. The lights were dim but warm, casting soft pools of glow across minimalist furnishings. It felt safe, quiet, perfect for rest. But as Claire unpacked, an uneasy feeling began to settle in her chest, a small, nagging sense that she wasn't quite alone. The building was too quiet, the shadows in the hallway darker than the soft lighting should have allowed. The faint sound of footsteps echoed faintly down the empty corridor, but when she looked through the peephole, no one was there. Claire shook the feeling off, telling herself it was just exhaustion, or the city settling down for the night. Yet beneath the surface, a small voice whispered that the night ahead would not be as simple as she hoped. As the clock ticked deeper into the night, the quietness of the apartment began to weigh heavily on Claire's mind. At first, it was just small, almost unnoticeable things. The softest knock at the door that seemed to come from nowhere, the faint rustle of footsteps in the hallway outside her door. She checked the peephole again, but the corridor was empty and still. Yet, the feeling that someone was close persisted, lingering like a shadow just beyond her sight. Her phone buzzed briefly with a message from Daniel, the host, a quick, "Let me know if you need anything." but when she replied with a question about the security cameras, there was no answer. The silence from him felt heavier now, as if something was being kept from her. Later, as she settled on the couch, the air shifted. A faint scent drifted in, something unfamiliar and sharp, almost like smoke or something burned. Then came the knocks again, this time more insistent, louder, but when she opened the door, the hallway remained empty. She tried to calm her nerves, attributing it to fatigue and the unfamiliar space. Then she noticed something else, small signs that unsettled her deeply. A cigarette, but in the corner of the balcony, still warm to the touch. The faintest scuff marks on the floor near the closet door. A cold spot that seemed to pulse when she stood there. A sudden drop in temperature that sent chills racing down her spine. Her instincts screamed at her that she was not alone. The building's silence was a mask. Beneath it, something else was moving. Her heart hammered as she paced the apartment, lights flickering briefly, plunging her into near darkness before returning. In the quiet moments, muffled whispers seemed to drift from the walls, barely audible but unmistakably there. Claire felt eyes on her, unseen and unblinking. She moved toward the closet, a faint creak catching her attention. The door was slightly ajar, though she was certain she had closed it. Her breath hitched, and just as she reached out to pull it open, a sudden noise behind her made her spin around. But no one was there. Claire's heart was pounding in her chest, each beat a thunderclap in the suffocating silence of the apartment. The flickering lights cast strange shapes on the walls, and the air grew colder, almost biting at her skin. She stood frozen in the living room, the slightly open closet door before her seeming to breathe with a life of its own. A dark invitation she wasn't sure she wanted to accept. The silence shattered suddenly with a soft, scraping sound coming from inside the closet. It was faint at first, like a quiet shifting of something heavy against the floor. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath her tentative steps. Her hand reached out, fingers trembling as they touched the cold edge of the closet door. Slowly, she pulled it open. Inside, the cramped space was far larger than it should have been. The walls of the closet stretched back into darkness, deeper than the apartment's architecture allowed. Faint light revealed a narrow crawlspace just large enough for a person to squeeze through. Her skin prickled with unease. A sudden rush of cold air escaped from the opening, carrying with it a faint, musty smell, the scent of long-forgotten corners hidden away from the world. Then a soft sound, a breath, shallow and uneven, came from deep within the crawlspace. Claire's eyes widened. The space was not empty. Before she could react, a shadow moved at the edge of her vision. A shape, hunched and barely visible, vanished back into the darkness beyond the crawlspace's entrance. Her breath caught, and a cold sweat broke out across her skin. She turned swiftly toward the door, heart hammering wildly, only to find it slammed shut, locked tight with a sudden, echoing bang. Trapped. A faint whisper grazed her ear, too soft to understand, but heavy with warning. Panic surged through her as the apartment's silence returned, now thicker, heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Claire was not alone, and the person who had been living hidden inside her rental was still there, somewhere watching, waiting. When the door finally creaked open, Claire didn't hesitate. She stumbled out of the closet crawlspace, breath ragged, limbs trembling as adrenaline propelled her forward. She rushed to the apartment's front door, fumbling desperately with the lock. It opened, spilling her into the silent hallway, the cold air outside rushing to greet her like a refuge she never expected to find. She left the building without looking back, heart still pounding, every shadow in the corridor seeming to pulse with hidden life. Later, when she contacted the police, they took her story seriously. The hidden crawlspace, the noises, the feeling of being watched. What shocked her most was what they uncovered next. They found evidence that someone had been living secretly inside the apartment's walls for weeks. A squatter who had managed to remain hidden, even as tenants came and went. He had no official records, no contact with the host. The cigarettes, the faint noises, the cold spots, they were all traces of his presence. Claire's experience was not isolated. Authorities revealed similar cases in the area where squatters had taken refuge in rental properties, moving silently through hidden spaces that most wouldn't think to check. But the host never told her, nor the building management. She never stayed another night there. And the crawlspace door? It's still there, hidden behind the closet, waiting. Because sometimes, the walls you think protect you are the very places where danger hides. For Mark and Sarah, the weekend was meant to be a quiet escape. Just the two of them, far from the noise of the city. They found a cabin nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The listing promised peace, fresh air, and a chance to reconnect with nature. The surrounding trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze as the gravel road wound through the forest. When they arrived, the neighbors they saw were few and distant. A handful of cabins dotted the landscape, but the people who lived there kept to themselves. One neighbor in particular was spoken of in vague terms, never seen but always there. The locals called him the Watcher, a presence more felt than seen, a shadow lingering just beyond the tree line. As evening settled, thick fog rolled in, swallowing the woods and creeping toward the cabin like a slow, silent tide. The air grew cold and damp, clinging to their skin and seeping through the cracks in the wooden walls. Inside, the cabin was warm and rustic, with soft light spilling from the fireplace and casting flickering patterns across the walls. But outside, the fog thickened, muffling the sounds of the forest and distorting the familiar into something strange and unfamiliar. The trees, once comforting, now seemed to lean closer, their shapes twisting in the mist. The night wrapped around the cabin like a shroud, pressing in and hiding whatever lurked just beyond the firelight. Mark glanced out the window, catching a glimpse of something moving just at the edge of the fog. A figure, tall and still, watching silently. Sarah felt it too, the weight of unseen eyes, the quiet that was anything but peaceful. They were not alone. As night deepened, the fog outside thickened, swallowing the landscape whole. Mark and Sarah sat close to the fireplace, the flickering flames casting long, wavering shadows across the wooden walls. The crackle of the fire was the only sound for a while, until it was broken by a faint tapping, slow and rhythmic, coming from somewhere outside the cabin. Mark paused, listening. The tapping seemed to come from the direction of the neighboring cabin, the one with no known occupant. Sarah's eyes narrowed, a chill creeping up her spine despite the warmth inside. The tapping continued, steady and unnerving, like the measured steps of a visitor who refused to be ignored. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the room into near darkness for a heartbeat before snapping back. The brief blackout left them both tense, the quiet now filled with whispered noises, soft murmurs and distant footsteps that didn't belong to either of them. Outside, through the fogged window, faint music began to play, slow, haunting notes drifting on the night air, though there was no visible source. The couple exchanged uneasy glances. The power flickered again, and the room seemed colder, the air heavier. They tried to brush off the sounds, blaming old wiring or wildlife. But then came the soft, uneven footsteps right outside the cabin door, footsteps that circled slowly, as if someone was pacing, watching, waiting. Sarah moved toward the door, heart pounding. When she peered through the peephole, nothing was there. Yet, when she stepped back, muddy footprints marked the porch, fresh and undeniable. A whisper brushed past her ear, a breathy voice that seemed to say, "You shouldn't be here." Mark and Sarah felt the walls closing in, the forest pressing closer, the fog swallowing all sense of safety. They were trapped in a place where the unseen was very much alive. The pounding of Mark's heart echoed in his ears as the night closed in around them. The fog pressed relentlessly against the cabin windows, blotting out the world beyond and wrapping them in a suffocating silence, broken only by the faint, deliberate pounding on the front door. It was slow at first, a measured rhythm that seemed almost purposeful, as if whatever was outside was toying with them. Sarah stood frozen beside him, eyes wide with terror, the warmth of the fire unable to chase away the cold crawling up her spine. She could hear the wood creaking under the weight of the unseen visitor's steps, the soft shuffle of shoes pressing against the porch. The pounding grew louder, more urgent, like a heartbeat matching her own. Mark moved toward the door, each step heavy with dread. As he reached out to grasp the handle, the door swung open on its own, a cold gust rushing in that snuffed out the fire's flames in a sudden, cruel breath of darkness. The cabin plunged into near blackness, broken only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the fog. In that flickering twilight, Mark caught a glimpse of something moving just beyond the threshold. A tall, dark figure, blurred and shifting in the mist, its presence undeniable and yet impossible to fully see. A low whisper rolled through the night air, carrying a warning as chilling as the fog itself. "You shouldn't be here." The footsteps retreated slowly into the woods, swallowed by the thick mist, leaving behind only muddy prints that led away from the cabin and vanished into the darkness. The silence returned, deeper and heavier than before, as Mark and Sarah were left alone, trapped inside a place that felt less like a refuge and more like a cage. They realized then that some neighbors never truly leave. and some shadows never stop watching. When dawn finally broke, the fog began to lift, retreating like a tide from the woods surrounding the cabin. Mark and Sarah sat silently by the window, the morning light failing to wash away the unease that had settled deep within their bones. Outside, the forest looked peaceful once more, but the memory of the night's events clung to them like a shadow. Locals later told them the story of the neighbor they never saw, a man who had lived alone in the woods for years before disappearing without a trace. Some said he was still there, watching from the mist, unable or unwilling to leave the place he once called home. The cabin's silence had never truly been empty. It had held a presence, patient and unseen, waiting for those who dared to step inside. Mark and Sarah left that weekend with heavy hearts and restless minds, carrying with them the weight of knowing that the woods keep their secrets close, and some visitors never really leave. Even now, when the wind moves through the trees or a sudden chill brushes the skin, the thought lingers. In that remote place, something watches silently, just beyond the edge of sight, waiting for the fog to roll back in. Now, imagine yourself standing alone in a place like one of these. A quiet house with a locked door no one wants to open, a city apartment hiding secrets behind its walls, or a remote cabin swallowed by fog and silence. What would you do if you were there, alone in the dark, feeling eyes watching, footsteps moving just out of sight? Would you find the courage to stay, to face whatever might be waiting? Or would you run, heart pounding, as fast as your legs could carry you, away from the shadows and the silence? These stories are not just tales, they are reminders that sometimes, the places we think are safe hold mysteries we are never meant to uncover, and the unknown can be closer than we imagine. I want to hear from you. Have you ever stayed somewhere that gave you that same uneasy feeling, that subtle hint that you might not be alone? What did you do? Share your thoughts, your fears, or even your own terrifying Airbnb experiences in the comments below. Your stories might be the next to chill us all to the bone. And if you want to keep hearing real horror stories that will linger long after the lights go out, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notification. There's so much more waiting in the shadows. Remember, sometimes the safest places are the ones where the darkest secrets hide.